Happy Monday, guys. I'm looking out my window right now and it is beautiful outside. I hope you guys have all taken a moment to step outside, enjoy a little bit of fresh air, maybe go for a walk. Um, I've graded most of your personal essays. I still have a couple essays that I need to grade, but most of those have been finished. If you haven't finished those, please make sure you get them in, right, guys? So remember, I'm giving you 2 days to finish an assignment before it's considered late, okay? Um, if you have any questions or need any help with your work throughout the week, I'm available Monday and Wednesday in Google Meet. That happens from 11:15 a.m. until about 12:30 p.m., okay? If you're not able to make that time, you still need help, you can always reach me through Google Classroom. I'm more than happy to help you guys. So let's go ahead and get started. Last um, lecture, we talked about Clinton's foreign policy. Today, we are going to transition into George W. Bush. He is president from 2001 all the way to, I'm sorry, 2000 to 2008. Um, so let's just jump into this do now. Question number one is, what is the purpose of NAFTA? So remember, NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement, right? Um, what was the purpose of NAFTA? We talked about uh, who was involved: Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. Remember, we mentioned tariffs. Tariffs are those taxes that we put on imported goods, right? So what was the point of NAFTA? Number two, what is a multinational corporation? Remember, corporation's another fancy name for a business, right? And so if we're thinking of multinational corporation, what do you think that means? And then make sure you get the right to learn, guys. So while I'm lecturing, I'm going to be kind of quick. So if at any point you need to stop, write down answers, watch videos, go ahead and pause the video and work on the section that you're on. So the learning objective, again, we're going to talk about George W. Bush, and then specifically we're going to talk about his domestic policies. So that includes No Child Left Behind, Katrina, and the economic crisis of 2008, and 9/11. So these are two candidates. These are our two candidates for the 2000 election. On the left is George W. Bush, and on the right is a man by the name of Al Gore. Both of them ran for president. George Bush was the Republican, and Al Gore was the Democrat. So there's a couple of interesting things about the results of this election. If you look at this map, this shows which state voted for which candidate, right? So the blue represents Bush and the red represents Gore, right? The interesting thing about the U.S. election system is that we're kind of different. We use something known as the Electoral College, and the way that a candidate wins is that they have to receive votes from the Electoral College. So uh, on your sheet here, your assignment, there's a box that says popular vote under the do now. So make sure you get the notes for popular vote. Popular vote is just a fancy way of saying how many votes you get in total, right? In general. Um, so total number of votes in the whole country. So that's the popular vote. Make sure you get that. The second box is Electoral College. Votes from the Electoral College. The winner of each state election determines who wins the election. So, for example, here in Texas, when voters in Texas go to vote, uh, depending on which candidate wins the state of Texas, the U.S. Those running for office will receive 32 votes from Texas if they win the state of Texas. So during this election, Bush won the state of Texas, so he got 32 electoral votes, right? If you look at California, for example, California is worth 54 electoral college votes, and Gore won California. So an interesting thing about the electoral college, the reason Texas has 32 votes, for example, electoral college votes, and Oklahoma only has 8 electoral college votes is because it works off the population of the state. Okay? So one glaring problem that a lot of people saw with this election is that George Bush actually lost the popular vote, right? He lost the total number of votes. Al Gore actually won the popular vote. However, Bush won the electoral college votes, right? Um, so he won 50.4% of the popular. And then, oops, I think these numbers are, sorry, I'm getting these backwards. So um, Bush lost the popular vote, but Bush won the electoral college vote, right? So this, at the end of this race, there was one state that had a really, 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 really close tally, and that was Florida. And so at the end of the election, the Gore campaign did not accept the results of the election, so they asked for a recount of the election. So eventually, the Supreme Court says no, and George W. Bush is instated as the new president of the United States. So if we look at our notes here, under the section 2000 presidential election, let's read this. It says the 2000 presidential election was controversial because a candidate won the election without winning the popular vote. After a recount of the votes in Florida was demanded by the candidate Al Gore, the Supreme Court intervened to prevent the recount, which might have changed the results of the election. In the end, George W. Bush became the 43rd president of the United States. So what we're saying is that if the Supreme Court would have allowed Al Gore to have his recount of the elections, it's very possible that George Bush would have won and Al Gore would have been president. But that's not what ends up happening. So what I want you to do is I want you to please watch the presidential recount video in Google Classrooms. I think that's going to be under, let me see which video that is. It's going to be the U.S. presidential election of 2000 recount. Okay, so make sure you watch that video. All right. And then the questions underneath, what are the two reasons the presidential election of 2000 was so controversial? If you read the passage, right, read that passage up above, you'll be able to find that answer. Okay. No Child Left Behind. So we're switching from kind of political and we're moving into education now. No Child Left Behind was a huge piece of legislation that was passed by the Bush administration. So let's go ahead and read a little bit about this. So look under the No Child Left Behind box here. It says, No Child Left Behind has had a big effect on the educational system of most American students because it requires states to test particular grade levels in order to receive federal funding. So schools all around the United States receive funding from their state, from their counties. They also receive money from the federal government as a result of No Child Left Behind. So one of the big reasons that the state has to provide a test for every grade level is because of No Child Left Behind. So think of one pro and one con of a system like this, all right? And then we are going to move on to Hurricane Katrina. So these were some of the photos for No Child Left Behind. There's George Bush actually signing the law into effect. One thing I failed to mention is I know that this year we have covered a lot of different topics in U.S. history, but occasionally we've come across the topic of education in the United States and who had access to education and which groups and which communities had access to education. So we know that there's been an inequality in which groups in the United States have received education. So the idea was from the federal government was to try to balance that, right? We want to provide funding for all schools around the U.S. So in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hits the United States. It hits the Gulf Coast, right? So if we look at this map right here, from Florida all the way down into Mexico, right? This area is known as the Gulf Coast. In particular, it hits this region right here, and Louisiana is hit particularly hard. The city of New Orleans probably sees the most damage through this storm. Now, one of the big questions is, well, why was New Orleans so um, why did we see such high amount of damage done in New Orleans compared to other cities along the Gulf Coast, right? Well, one of the big reasons is because the way that the city was set up, the kind of the geography of the city. If you look at this chart right here, this right here is New Orleans, right? So if you look below, this is New Orleans. These walls right here, they're known as levees. Levees, right? Levees are either natural or artificial walls that are built in order to prevent a city from flooding. So the interesting thing about New Orleans is that it's sandwiched between there's a river right here, and there's also access to the coast as well. And so the city itself resides under water. So these levees have to be put in place to stop water from going into the city. Well, when Hurricane Katrina hits, it actually destroys the levee. And if you again look at this picture, it's almost like the city's a bowl, you know. And as soon as that levee breaks, all of that water spills into the city, and this is the result here. You have entire neighborhoods that are flooded. Um, I remember turning on the news and seeing people rowing down the streets in boats. Oh, here's a picture right here that I put in. Um, People would get into boats and they would row across neighborhoods to find food, to help others. Imagine looking out your window and not seeing cars go by, but seeing boats going down your street. The devastation and the destruction was unimaginable. These kids right here are swimming in the street, not walking. So, one of the probably the hardest um, hit communities are those within the minority communities, right? What we saw after Hurricane Katrina was we saw entire communities going 4, 5, 6, 7 days without any sort of help. The federal government was slow to respond, and as a result, people would sometimes break into stores looking for food or batteries or flashlights, and so people were extremely desperate to receive the sort of resources and help um, that they needed. Those who were fortunate enough to get to safe, dry locations often met really crowded conditions. So if you look at this picture, this is, I forget what it's called. Maybe I think it's like the Superdome, or it's a really large sports complex in um, New Orleans, and so there's thousands and thousands of people in this stadium, and so conditions are all often unsanitary, and when you have a large amount of people in a small space like this, people get sick, and so it was a disaster in every sense of the word. So under Hurricane Katrina, let's read this real quick. It says, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, the levee system failed. Remember, the levees are those kind of those walls that keep out the water, causing massive flood in the city. Rescue efforts were so delayed that many citizens found themselves stranded for days on rooftops and in attics. Others were trapped in New Orleans Superdome, which is that picture right here that I was talking about, in hot, unsanitary conditions. Hurricane Katrina negatively impacted the American economy because it damaged U.S. oil and gas industries. Guys, this is really, really important. Um, it not only directly impacts the people in New Orleans and the surrounding communities, but it also hurts the U.S. economy. I want to take a quick look. I'm going to skip ahead real quick, but this right here is another picture of that Gulf Coast. So a large amount of the oil that we get here in the United States, that we produce here in the United States, comes from the Gulf of Mexico. And so whenever that hurricane hits Louisiana and New Orleans, it takes out a lot of the oil refineries that help refine the oil. It takes out companies that are responsible for distributing oil all across the United States. It devastates the oil and natural gas community, and that has a huge impact. It negatively impacts the U.S. economy. Okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to watch the Hurricane Katrina video. Um, so it's in your Google Classroom assignment folder here, and it's actually labeled as Hurricane Katrina. So go ahead and watch that. After you're done, we will continue. All right. So we read over this. These are the notes in your assignment. We are going to transition. So remember, that's 2005, right? Katrina hits in 2005. It damages the U.S. economy. And then in 2008, we probably have, we not probably, but we do have a major economic crisis in the United States. Okay, I'm going to try to make this as brief and as simple as possible. So bear with me, guys. If you're still a little confused about this, just back the video up um, and rewatch it if you need to, okay? So I'm going to go slow here. Basically, the reason that we see an economic crisis in 2008 is that banks were giving out loans for people who wanted to buy homes. Okay, so they were investing a lot of their money into the housing market, right? So they're giving a lot of money to people who wanted to give homes. Um, Often they were giving money to large amounts of money to families that couldn't necessarily pay off their mortgage. So as a result, many people couldn't pay their mortgages, and so we started seeing foreclosures when the bank takes your home. This happened on a large scale, and so it crashes the housing market, right? It crashes the market that oversees um, buying and selling of business and commercial properties, right? So as a result, because people can't pay their mortgages, the banks are losing lots of money. And so the banks, some really, really big banks in the United States are very close to being closed. And so at this point, the government has to make a decision. Are they going to be laissez-faire with their economic policies? Remember, we said laissez-faire was hands-off. So is the government going to decide to do nothing and let the big banks fail? Or will they get involved and try to stabilize the economy by saving the banks? So which one do you think the government will pick? Let's see if you're right. So here's a picture of the stock market, like we said. It's 2008, right? We're starting to see the stock market falling and crashing. If you think back to 1929, right? Remember, we saw the stock market crash that year as well. And what eventually happened because of that crash? What happened to the U.S. economy, and what time period or era in U.S. history did we enter because of a similar situation like this? That's right, the Great Depression, right? So let's see what the federal government does. George W. Bush decided to interject federal money into the economy to prevent the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 from triggering another Great Depression. So even though the banks made poor investments and they were responsible for the crash in the housing market, the federal government decided to go ahead and bail out these big banks. So they gave the big banks almost $700 billion to bail them out. And the reason they did this is because the U.S. was afraid that it might enter another Great Depression. There's one other thing that the president decides to do. Bush also decides to implement big tax cuts for businesses, right? And the idea of that was that if the government decides to put taxes into big businesses will, or decides to implement taxes, right? They'll have more money, right? And the idea is if they have more money, they can begin hiring more people. And those people who are hired can start working and they can start earning money and they can start buying products, and then businesses will have money and then they can hire more people and those people can make money and buy products, right? So the idea is that they're helping this economic cycle continue, right? We want to see the economy grow. So the US government decides to bail out the bank. So, in summary, financial crisis hits because the banks invest poorly in the housing market, right? That crashes. The government responds by giving money to those big banks to help them stabilize. And the government also decides to implement business taxes to help kick the economy, right? To help restart it. And this is what happens during the 2008 financial crisis. So let's take a look. I didn't go over the questions for Katrina. So it says, what does Kanye West believe about the president and why? If you've watched the video, you know exactly what he thinks. He makes it abundantly clear. Why was the city of New Orleans particularly devastated by Hurricane Katrina? Remember that picture I showed you? Why was the city flooded with water? What happened? Whoops. There we go. Sorry, I minimized that. So we are going to continue, guys. So I know that I think all of you know at least a little bit about 9/11, right? It's interesting because if you ask most adults and people that are old enough to remember 9/11, most of them know exactly what they were doing the day of 9/11. They know exactly what they were doing when they heard the news about 9/11. Guys, I was 10 years old when 9/11 happened. 10. And I'm sorry, I guess technically 11. And I remember exactly. I mean, with clear images in my head, I remember exactly what happened. Our teacher was in the class giving a lecture, and another teacher ran into the classroom. She didn't walk in; she ran in, and she told the teacher to stop what she was doing and turn on the TV. And when we turned on the TV, we could see the smoke. We could see one tower smoking. And so everybody was confused. Nobody had any idea what was going on. Many people thought that this was an accident. And then sometime later, we saw, bam, the next tower was struck, right? And so at that point, many Americans understood that this was not an accident, but this was intentional. And I can remember the school got all of the kids together excuse me, and they took us to the cafeteria, and they also took us to the gymnasium, and some kids were told to go to the playground, and they quit teaching classes for that day because nobody knew what was going on and what was going to happen. Many Americans thought that this was not going to be the only attack, that this was going to happen in other parts of the United States. So that turns out to be kind of true. There are 4 planes that were hijacked that day, guys. Terrorists took over 4 planes. 2 of them hit the World Trade Center. 1 of them landed in a field in Pennsylvania because the passengers fought back, and 1 of them hit the Pentagon. It's the building. It's a federal building responsible for national defense. So what I want you to do, there are 2 videos in this lesson. Okay, looks like I don't have them posted right now. I thought I posted them, but there are 2 videos. Both of them, they're actually one video, but I split them into 2, and they kind of show what happens on that day, and it asks real survivors who were there what it was like. So I want you to watch that video, and then I also want you to watch the video where George W. Bush gives a speech to all Americans. Okay. Okay. If I want you guys, actually, I noticed that I missed one section. It's above the September 11th and economic crisis of 2008 section. So it's a small paragraph and there's one quote analysis question. So it says, what Wall Street is to money as the Gulf Coast is to energy is a vast assemblage of refineries, storage tanks, and pipelines, and the petroleum engineers, energy consultants, and oil field workers who make them run. Oil production in the Gulf of Mexico accounts for nearly 30% of the U.S. total. Natural gas production is roughly 20% and 60% of the nation's oil imports that arrive at the Gulf ports. Nearly half of all U.S. oil refineries, the places where we refine and eventually make the final product for oil, are located in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So, right here, Gulf of Mexico. This is where the United States gets its largest amount of oil from domestically, and this is where 60% of uh, our oil consumption from other countries come through this port or this area right here. And this is where Hurricane Katrina hits. So, with that in mind, a quote analysis. According to the quote, why did Hurricane Katrina negatively impact the U.S. economy? So, why would that hurricane negatively impact the U.S. economy? Think about U.S. production of oil. Think about where it's located. Why would it negatively affect the U.S. economy? Okay. And then I want you to watch those two videos on 9/11 and the speech that President Bush gives. Okay. So let's look at these questions. So under September 11th, 2001, terrorist attacks, that section, let's read this together. It says Islamic extremist terrorists hijacked 4 U.S. planes. 2 of the planes were flown into the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 plane was flown into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The passengers on the 4th plane resisted the terrorist and the plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Osama bin Laden and his organization Al-Qaeda took credit for the attacks. Bin Laden was later protected by the Taliban in Afghanistan. So according to the videos that we watched, how did people respond to the collapse of the Second World Trade Center, right? How did people respond? What was their emotional response? What did they initially think? And eventually when they understood what was going on, what did they do? Why do you think the crowd responded positively to President Bush's statements? When President Bush stood up in New York City near Ground Zero and he gave his speech, why were so many people receptive of that message and why were they so positive when the president spoke? And then number 3, what do you think? Could the 9/11 terrorist attacks have been prevented? Do you think it was possible for the American government to know that this was going to happen? What do you guys think? And then make sure that you answer the questions under economic crisis. Okay. Other than that, guys, the rest of this is independent practice. I will go over these with you. If you need further help or you need me to explain something in further detail, Wednesday, guys, Wednesday, I am going to be on Google Meets on Wednesday at 11:15. Okay, so feel free to drop by, ask me any questions. I would love to be able to help you. Okay, or you can send me a message if you're stuck. Okay. So under George W. Bush, the economic crisis, it says, and this is a quote from him, it says, over the past few weeks, many Americans have felt anxiety about their finances and their future. I understand their worry and their frustration. We've seen triple-digit swings in the stock market. Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed. As uncertainty has grown, many banks have restricted lending, credit markets have frozen, and families and businesses have found it harder to borrow money. We're in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action. So I propose that the federal government reduce the risk posed by these troubled assets and supply urgently needed money so banks and other financial institutions can avoid collapse and resume lending. So he proposes that the federal government gives money to banks, right? This rescue effort is not aimed at preserving an individual company or industry. It is aimed at preserving America's overall economy. So number 1 says, according to the excerpt, how does George W. Bush plan on fixing the American economy? So we know that the markets are crashing. We know that the housing market's crashing. We know the banks have invested a lot of money in that. How is he going to fix the American economy? And then there's a picture here. What are two effects according to the political cartoon? So if we look at the man, what is he staring at and what is he shocked at? Right? So this is a picture regarding Hurricane Katrina. So keep that in the back of your mind. The background here is Hurricane Katrina. So what are two effects? Look at what's in front of him and look at what's behind him, right? What event caused rising gas prices? So again, what happened in New Orleans, right? What caused that damage? And number 3, explain why the man is ignorant about the world. What is he so focused on that he's forgetting or he's not paying attention to? And then we have 2 more sections. Another quote by President George W. Bush. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resource of federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. What is Bush's argument in the excerpt above? So, what's happened to the country, and what is his plan moving forward? What is his main argument? According to your notes, what was an effect of the September 11th terrorist attacks? So for question number 2, there's one last part that I left out here. And we're going to move on to that so we can answer the rest of these questions, okay? Because the rest of these questions have to do with the Patriot Act. So this right here is a picture of Osama bin Laden, right? He's the man, he's the mastermind behind the attacks on the United States on September 11th. So he commits these acts of terror, and he's actually located in Afghanistan. And so while he's in Afghanistan, the U.S. government demands that the Taliban government in Afghanistan hand over Saddam Hussein. The government in Afghanistan refuses, and so the United States invades and eventually, well, long story short, after years and years and years of hunting, Osama bin Laden, is found, right? So the important thing to remember, guys, is that there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, 1.5 billion practitioners of Islam, and Al Qaeda makes up a super small percentage of those Muslims around the world. And so these were people who had very extreme views. They did not follow mainstream religious practices of Islam, and really they don't represent the religion as a whole. Okay. So after 9/11, one of the first things that we see as far as domestic policies, we see something known as the Patriot Act. And so the Patriot Act, in short, it helps law enforcement agencies and it helps the federal government work on finding and detecting terrorism in the United States and outside of the United States. So that can be wiretaps, that can be surveillance, search warrants, creating harsher punishments for people who commit acts of terror, and so it overall it gives law enforcement more powers to do that. There are critics of the Patriot Act, and those critics, most of them will assert that the problem with this is that the more power we give to the federal government to do things like surveil people, to search their private property and their belongings, the more power we give to the federal government to do that, the less the less freedom we have, the more rights we give away to the federal government. And so that last bullet point says some critics assert that it infringes upon the constitutional rights of Americans and overextends the federal federal and local law enforcement powers. So that is it, guys. This last section is a picture of our theme, our mascot this year. I don't want to say mascot, but he's been a central theme in U.S. history this year, and that's Uncle Sam, right? So on the poster it says the Patriot Act, turning citizens into suspects since 2001. So what was the Patriot Act? We talked about it. If you look on this slide right here, it can kind of give you a better idea. So what is the Patriot Act? What is the main argument of the political cartoon? What do you think the author thinks about the Patriot Act? And according to Image, what is one major criticism of the Patriot Act? What is he criticizing? And then name another time freedoms were taken away. Be very specific. What are other times that freedoms have been taken away from American citizens? So think about what we've talked about over the year. It could be an economic freedom. It could be a political freedom. Think about something that we've discussed this year. So I know that was really quick, guys. I covered this super fast, but if you're struggling with any part of this, just make sure you rewatch the video. Other than that, come see me on Wednesday, or you can see me on Monday when I go over this live. All right. And you can always reach me through email as well. So enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Go out for a walk, relax a little bit. Make sure you're practicing good social distancing. You're washing your hands a lot. That way we can all get back to school as soon as possible. So talk to you later, guys. Bye.